Good morning and welcome. This is day 5 of the hearings of the submissions on change number 7 to the Canterbury Land and Water Regional Plan and change 2 to the WRRP River Regional Plan. There are 3 hearing commissioners, but today Commissioner Solomon is not with us. She has had a family bereavement and has sent her apologies. She will catch up with these proceedings by the audio-visual record. But she's not able to take part this morning. Our first business today is the submission of the Central South Island Fish and Game, and we're ready to hear from the representatives of the Fish and Game Council.
Tēnā koutou, good morning. Firstly, thank you for the opportunity to appear at the hearing. I understand that our further submission and evidence lodged is taken as read. Therefore, I would just like to make a brief comment on 2 aspects of the Fish and Game submission and the subsequent evidence that I lodged. Firstly, in relation to policy 4.102, the NPS FM 2020 became operative on the 3rd of September and sets out a specific objective that each regional council must include in its regional plan to address fish passage. The regional council is then required to set policies to achieve the objective and must A, take into account any management plans, and B, must seek advice from the Department of Conservation and statutory fishery managers, of which Central South Island Fish and Game Council is one of. This process is yet to be undertaken. Until this work is undertaken, it is appropriate to develop an interim policy to recognize and provide for fish passage. In the evidence of Mr. Murray Brass, on behalf of the Department of Conservation, he has recommended an amended policy 4.102 in his rebuttal evidence and has shared this with Fish and Game. Fish and Game supports the amendments to policy 4.102 offered by Mr. Brass and recognizes that additional work will need to be done by the Regional Council in the future to give full effect to the NPS FM 2020. The other comment that I wish to make is in relation to 2 proposed waterways included in Schedule 17 salmon spawning sites within the Central South Island Fish and Game region. The sites are at the Upper Ohau and Lower Ohau rivers. And in the evidence of Mr. Andrew Faraband on behalf of Meridian Energy, he sought changes to the spatial extent of the sites due to the proximity of the boundaries of the sites in relation to the Waitaki Power Scheme infrastructure. He proposes pictorial references in his evidence that restricts the proposed Schedule 17 sites on their upper extents. Fish and Game has considered the evidence of Mr. Faraband and the commentary in the Section 42A report on the matter. While Fish and Game cannot agree that activities undertaken in the proposed exclusion zone will not have adverse impacts on the salmon spawning population and can depend on the time of year that the asset management works takes place, Fish and Game acknowledges the regionally significant infrastructure at these sites and accepts the refinement of the upper extent of these 2 sites as proposed by Meridian. Fish and Game will work with Meridian outside of this planning process to best manage any impacts on spawning populations at these locations. That is all the comments that I have in relation to the evidence that I lodged, and I believe my colleague Mark Webb has some comments to make in the opening.
Well, thank you very much for that. And Mr. Webb, please feel free to add your comments when you're ready.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou, Commissioners. My name is Mark Webb and I'm a Fish and Game Officer. Just in a brief summary of my evidence, there's 3 parts to my evidence on fish and game values: the Temuka, then the other Opahi tributaries, and the Opahi main stem. In regard to the Temuka River, currently the Temuka flow and allocation is a bit of a mess. The ORP has not been recognised in terms of the allocation limit, and consents have been issued above the allocation limit. And the allocation blocks overlap, so there is no provision for natural variation in the flow between those 2 allocation blocks. Fish and Game was a participant on the Temuka Catchment Working Party that developed community acceptable solutions to these problems. The community recommendations are the backbone of the proposed Plan Change 7 minimum flows and allocations. Minimum flows in Plan Change 7 provide significant increases in autumn habitat for salmon and trout spawning, and summer juvenile trout, adult trout and food producing habitat. These are meaningful improvements that, along with a program for reducing allocation and eliminating the overlap of allocation blocks, will improve salmonid populations and the recreation they sustain. In the North and South Opua, Upper Opahi and Te Anawai, these are typical Canterbury coastal rivers fed from foothills, and they do not originate from the Southern Alps. They naturally have low summer flows, and even with no abstraction, summer angling would be restricted by low flows. The angling amenity in these tributaries is in spring and autumn. Generally in these tributaries, there are 2 steps to address minimum flows: allocation, sharing restrictions, and timing. The first step significantly improved autumn, winter and spring minimum flows with monthly and sometimes fortnightly variation. These gains are most important for adult salmonid migration and spawning and rearing of juvenile salmonids. The first step also increases summer minimum flows. The second step further increases summer minimum flows. Invariably, the second step does not further increase spring, winter and autumn minimum flows. The minor additional increases in summer minimum flows will not noticeably improve adult trout habitat, food producing habitat or angling amenity. If these rivers are anywhere near the proposed Step 2 minimum flows, anglers won't be there. They won't be fishing. The flows that attract angler attention in midsummer are much higher than Step 2. The increased summer minimum flows in Step 2 will provide minor improvement in juvenile trout habitat, and in the case of the Te Anawai, when combined with pro rata irrigation restrictions, it's predicted to maintain summer flow continuity in the Te Anawai, and that's certainly an advantage. The Opahi River. The WRRP Saleyards Bridge variable minimum flow was developed with significant input from Fish and Game up to and during commissioning of the Opua Dam in 1998. I believe the minimum flow regime has been very successful at making best use of an environmental allocation to improve river mouth condition and the recreational amenity of the river. The only complaint Fish and Game has received in regard to the minimum flows has been about the low January and February minimum flows. Fish and Game supports the flow regime that prioritises retaining connectivity of the river in low flow periods by retaining greater storage earlier in the season, even though this may come at a cost of reduced minimum flows. Since 1998, the river has never run dry. Fish and Game is a member of the Adaptive Management Working Group and supports the Saleyards Bridge flow regime presented as Table 14V2 in the Adaptive Management Working Group submission. Now, I've also prepared some supplementary evidence or supplementary information which I am hoping that you have been provided with, which is the spaghetti charts of the habitat. Now these are...
do have that.
Okay, great. These are simply another representation of the information presented in the NIWA 2018 and 2019 reports. I've grouped the charts as native fish, salmonids, and then combined of all fish plus food-producing habitat. The only addition I've made to these charts is that I've added an average for each of those three groups, which represents the average of the habitat availability for all of those species for any particular flow. So I believe this allows easier interpretation of flows suitable for species or for a group of species. That's all I have. Thank you very much.
Well, many thanks to both of you for the trouble you've taken in preparing your statements of evidence and providing them to us in a timely way so that we can go through them, as we've also gone through the original submission and the further submission. And if it's convenient with you, we'll now see if we have some questions for one or both of you. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen, any questions for the Fish and Game representatives?
Yes, thank you, and good morning, Commissioner Shepherd. Yes, most questions, and I found your evidence to be very comprehensive and clear, so I only have one question for you at paragraph 118. And so this relates to fish passage and culverts.
Yes.
And I understand that the depth of the culvert or the extent to which it can be buried is something that is easily controlled by someone putting in a culvert. But in terms of then requiring a certain depth of water through the culvert, I don't understand how that can be guaranteed, because it must depend on whatever flow is in the stream or the creek that's being culverted at the time. So I understand how you can require the first, but I don't understand how you can require the second.
Yes, so if I could just offer from the New Zealand Fish Passage Guidelines, we looked into this particular aspect, and they talk about they use a formula. So they say that in particular to your question around, if the rest of the river is dry or if it's at a particularly low flow, they have a statement in there that says if the minimum water depth is naturally less then mouth is what they use, that it's appropriate to use the natural stream environment as the benchmark for defining water depth for the culvert. And so I guess that would be, the most practical way to look at that. But we do find that if there's not appropriate flow through the culvert, that you're actually not maintaining any sort of fish passage. And so just by burying it to a certain depth doesn't actually provide for that. And so it needs that other part in terms of water flow to be able to do that. And I guess the guidelines, they did look at the most practical ways to do that. And that's what the recommendation that came out of that whole working committee for these guidelines was.
Yeah, that doesn't really help me. I don't understand how you can create flow in a stream or a creek that's not already there. I mean, whatever flow is naturally flowing above the culvert will flow through the culvert, and that's just simply what will happen.
Yep, unless that point is taken. But if there is multiple braids through that section, then they're saying if there's more water, say, in the other braid and none coming down, the braid where the culvert is being put into. So if there was water there, then they put the culvert in and the depth isn't appropriate, that's where the fish passage needs to be maintained. If the rest of the stream is dry, then it's appropriate to look to the rest of the stream environment in terms of how you would, provide for that passage or not. If it's a dry environment, you're obviously not, there are no fish that will be migrating through there.
So you're saying if there's a braided river and someone wants to culvert one braid, then they should be diverting water from another braid to go through that culvert to ensure fish passage?
No, I think it's relevant to the stream environment that you're putting the culvert into. So if it was a naturally flowing braid, then that needs to be maintained.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Okay. So the bottom line is just maintain the natural flow that's in
That's
whatever
right.
creek or stream is being culverted.
That's right.
All right, okay. Thank you, that was the only question I had.
I hope one of you will be able to help me with something that I'm not clear about too. Salmonids prey on some indigenous species, is that right?
That would be correct.
And did they prey on some species that are also food for indigenous fish?
Yes?
Yes.
And is it Fish and Game's policy that regional plans should make provision to allow salmonids passage to places where they would predate on indigenous fish and on food for indigenous fish?
So our current policy is that we would not support sports fish in areas where there is not currently sports fish. If there are places where there are threatened indigenous fish, then we work with the Department of Conservation and with the Regional Council to assess that particular waterway's contribution to the salmonid fishery. And if we determine that it's not a valuable site, then we support the department in erecting fish barriers at that location. So just, I think about 2 weeks ago, we supported another one up in the Waitaki Basin.
So you see your role as deciding which areas should be open for passage by salmonids to where they might predate on indigenous fish.
So our role under the Conservation Act is to manage, maintain, and enhance the sports fishery in the interest of anglers. And so that's our statutory role. And I guess it's a reality that big fish eat small fish, and we absolutely don't deny that, and that salmonids do eat smaller native fish. But we do recognize the importance of native fish. And so we try and work with the appropriate departments and regional councils to address where we can help protect those.
And is there a role for indigenous peoples in that kind of process too?
The current process that we work under in terms of erecting fish barriers, is that what you're asking in terms of the barrier question? There is a consent that's held by the regional council, and that consent requires that Fish and Game dock, and it might be, I can check if I think Runanga as well must give approval to those particular sites.
Yes. Well, that was you come to the point of my question.
Yes.
Yes. Well, I think that's clarified my understanding of something I wasn't clear about, so I'm grateful to you for that. And I think that's all we have by way of questions. Again, I thank you both for the full presentation that you've made that we were able to study in advance. And thank you both for coming in today and for answering the questions the two of us who are here today are able to ask you.
Sorry, Commissioner Shepherd, sorry, I had a couple of questions for Mr. Webb.
Oh, all right.
Sorry, I thought we're going to go through them one by one.
Difficult if we can't see each other.
I know, that's
Please,
a bit tricky.
Please go ahead.
So, Mr. Webb, I found your evidence also to be very comprehensive, and I'd just like to compliment you on what I found to be the objective nature of your evidence.
Thank you.
I find that very refreshing, and particularly where you took care to point out to us what you saw as the limited benefit of some of the Step 2 changes to the minimum flows and what I'm calling the overheat tributaries. So I found that very helpful. So I just only have one question for you, and it derives from your paragraph 10.19. You don't have to go there because it refers to table 14R in PC7. Do you have that handy? It's the Te Anawai Environmental Flow and Allocation Regime, table 14R.
PQR.
Yeah.
Yes, I have that.
Yep, so just one question. In terms of the restrictions, I see in your evidence you support the stepped restrictions. I was just wondering, would it be more appropriate to move directly to pro rata restrictions or to bring them in, I think table 14S has them coming in at 2030. Would it be beneficial to either move directly to pro rata or to bring them in earlier than 2030?
In the dealings that I've had, excuse me, with the community groups that I've been involved with, which have principally been abstractors, irrigators,
Yep.
Generally the minimum flows have been more accepted. Increasing the minimum flows have been more acceptable than the pro rata.
Yep.
And I acknowledge that for the irrigators, it does place quite a bit more hardship on them than just the minimum flow increases.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly for the Te Anawai, the increase in the summer minimum flow combined with the pro rata is what is going to maintain the connectivity in that river.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think I also value the relationships that have been established with the irrigators in terms of positively accepting the changes, and I think my understanding is that the pro rata, because it is such a significant change for the abstractors, that shortening up the period for introduction of pro rata is a very difficult step for them to take, and I value the positive community spirit rather than the strict enforcement of a much shorter time period for pro rata.
Okay. So I guess in a nutshell, you're still comfortable with that coming in at 2030, the pro rata?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And other than that, no further questions. I made lots of notes and references in your evidence that we obviously will come back to as part of our deliberations, but there's nothing else I wish to clarify with you. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for coming in this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Fernando, is there other business for us this morning, or do we adjourn now until this afternoon?
No, there's no other business for this morning, so we can adjourn.
Sorry, Commissioner Shepherd, I see the Philip Moore and the officers are here, and they've provided a second set of answers to our day one questions, which we were emailed at some stage in the recent past. I've just got one or two matters I wouldn't mind putting to the officers while they're here, if that's okay.
Thank you. Yes, let's do that.
So, I guess to the officers, just the first question is, it addressed that issue I raised about trying to understand minimal and what that might mean in practice, and you gave some useful practical examples of that, so thank you. So just want to clarify my understanding then. So where a policy or a rule refers to minimal, the effects that it's describing are less than minor, but more de minimis, so somewhere in that range.
Yes.
Okay. And having investigated practical examples of that, and I take it the officers, or are the officers still happy with the use of the word minimal?
Yes.
Okay. Just in terms of the high naturalness water bodies issue, thank you for putting together that rule 14.5.6a for us to consider. And there's a number of submitters later on this week who referred to that the issue with renewing irrigation consents in the high naturalness water bodies, so it's helpful to have that information from the officers available. Thank you for that. And Ms Hayward, thank you for your the work you did on the dissolved oxygen versus concentration issues. Can I just ask you, if you haven't already, can you make sure that your recommendations, particularly for the Opua or Lake Opua, are drawn to the attention of the Opua Water and the AMWG, so when they come to present to us, not this week anymore, but week 3, that they can maybe comment on your suggestions. If you haven't already done that, that would be helpful.
Yes, we'll attend to that.
Okay. So thank you, Commissioner Shepherd. They were the only matters that I just wished to ask the officers about.
Very well. Well, we'll retire now and resume our sitting at 2 o'clock.
Thank you.